The Daily Life of the Aztecs on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest by Jacques Soustelle. Chapter 6. War. War. The meaning of war in religious myth and its legal justification. Casus belli. Chivalry in the negotiations leading to the declaration of war. Conduct of war. Negotiations for peace. Why the Mexicans were overcome by the Spanish invaders. War, Vaillant, was so important a preoccupation with the Aztecs, and it held so great a place in the structure of their society and the life of their state, that it seems necessary to treat it separately. We have already seen the general idea of the nature of war and the religious and mythical connotations that it possessed. Sacred war was a cosmic duty. It was symbolized by the double glyph atlatinoli, water, that is blood, and conflagration, which, like an obsession, continually recurs in all the bas-reliefs of the Teocalli of sacred war. Men, by waging war, complied with what had been the will of the gods since the beginning of the world. According to the legend, the 400 cloud serpents, sent on Mimishkoa, the northern stars, which had been created by the higher gods to give food and drink to the sun, abandoned their duty. They took a jaguar and did not give it to the sun. They decked themselves with feathers. They went to bed with their feather ornaments on. They slept with women, and they became drunk with the wine of Tsiuactli. So the sun spoke to the men who were born after the Mimishkoa and said to them, "My sons, you must now destroy the 400 cloud serpents, for they do not give anything either to our father or to our mother." And it was thus that war began. But as well as its mythical religious aspect, war had another side. It was the imperialistic city's means of conquest, and as such it acquired a justificatory legal basis. The official version of the three allied cities, Mexico, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, was founded upon two pseudo-historical claims. It was asserted that the three dynasties had succeeded the Toltecs, who had ruled over all of central Mexico, by right, and at the same time that, thanks to the House of Texcoco, the descendants of the Chichimex conquerors, they had a kind of suzerainty over the whole country. The three rulers thought of themselves as lords and masters over all the others, basing themselves upon the right that they claimed to have over the whole country, which had belonged to the Toltecs, whose heirs and successors they were, and upon the fresh conquest of the land by the great Chichimex Xolotl, their ancestor. From this point of view, any city that was independent and intended to stay independent was a rebel. In practice, a casus belli was needed to attack a city or a province. The most usual rose from attacks on the traveling posteca or traders. If they were robbed, pillaged, and even perhaps massacred, then the military forces of the empire at once prepared to avenge them. The documents make it clear that a refusal to trade or the breaking off of commercial relations was considered to be tantamount to a declaration of war. Ishli Sochi justifies the undertakings of the central cities by stating as the motive that the others had not agreed to trade or communicate with our people. The Mexicans set out for the conquest of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec after the inhabitants of several towns in that region had killed nearly all the members of a caravan of merchants. The cause of the war between Mexico and the neighboring city of Coyoacan was the rupture of the traditional trading relations. The Mexican women set off carrying fish, frogs, and ducks to sell them at Coyoacan. Guards who had been placed on the roads thither took away everything that they had brought. They went back into Tenochtitlan weeping and mourning. After this insult, the Mexican women no longer went to the market at Coyoacan, and the chief of that city, seeing this, addressed his dignitaries and said to them, "Brothers, you see that the Mexican women do not come to the market any more. This is no doubt because of the insults that we have offered them. Let us then get our weapons ready, our shields and our swords, for soon we shall see the Mexicans coming, led by the banner of the eagle and the tiger." There were other accepted casus belli. A ruler, having called his council to get it to take the final decision, was required to show the reasons that appeared to him to justify an expedition. If it was because merchants had been killed, the council would answer that it was a good reason and a just cause, meaning thereby that trade and business are a natural right, like hospitality and welcome for travelers, and that it was lawful to make war against those who did not observe this rule. If it was a messenger who had been killed, or if the ruler gave some other minor reason, the council said to him as many as 3 times, "Why do you want to make war?" meaning thereby that was not a just nor a sufficient cause. But if the ruler called them together several times, the council yielded in the end. To judge by the Mexican chronicles, some wars broke out solely for political reasons. That is, because one city distrusted the undertakings of another and decided to attack by way of defense. The people of Azcapotzalco declared war against Tenochtitlan the day after the election of Itzcoatl, because of the hatred of the Mexicans that filled their hearts, and fearing no doubt that the new sovereign would lead his tribe in a career of conquest, they determined to crush the menace in its beginnings and to exterminate the Mexicans. 50 years later, the Emperor Axayacat decided to launch an attack upon Tlatelolco, Mexican's twin city, for he was persuaded that its ruler was trying to ally himself secretly with the neighboring cities in order to make war on Tenochtitlan at the first opportunity. When there was a high degree of tension and distrust between cities, the most trivial incident could set off the conflict. In fact, it was the scolding and the insults of the market women of Tlatelolco that began the war between these two. Generally speaking, however, the war, fighting itself, only started after long and painful negotiations. When Azcapotzalco, having decided to wipe out the Aztecs, began hostilities by pushing their forward post to the outskirts of the city, several Mexican embassies were still able to cross the lines with the enemy's permission to try to negotiate peace. These conversations broke down before the determination of the men of Azcapotzalco to be done with this dangerous tribe, but up to the end of the coming and going of the envoys and their interviews with the enemy sovereign were surrounded with the traditional ceremony. When at least it appeared that no possibility of peace remained, the Antepanecat Tlacaeleltzin was charged with the last embassy to the ruler of Azcapotzalco. He brought him the gifts of a cloak, a feather crown, and some arrows. The enemy king thanked him and begged him to carry his acknowledgments to Itzcoatl. Then he gave him a shield, a sword, and a splendid warrior suit, desiring him to do his best to return to his place safe and sound. All this passed according to the rules of a courteous and chivalrous ceremonial, which requires that enemies who are about to engage should treat one another with all the marks of esteem. At the time when the alliance of the three cities was at the height of its power, it scrupulously observed complex rules before entering into a war. The idea that underlay their approach was that the city which was intended to be incorporated into the empire really already belonged to it by a certain kind of right. This was the official theory mentioned earlier on. And if the city accepted this, if it agreed without a struggle, then it was not even required to pay tribute. A voluntary gift would be enough, and the Mexican state would not even send an official to collect it. Everything would be based upon a friendly agreement. Each of the three imperial cities had its own ambassadors, who played their successive parts in the proceedings which were intended to make the province in question submit without a war. First, the ambassadors of Tenochtitlan, the Cuauhtémoc, presented themselves before the authorities of the place. They spoke in particular to the elders, dwelling upon the miseries that arise from war. Would it not be far more simple, they asked, if your sovereign were to accept the friendship and the protection of the empire? All that was required was that the Lord should give his word never to be an enemy of the empire, and to let the traders and their people come and go, buy and sell. The ambassadors also asked that the ruler should admit an image of Huitzilopochtli into his temple upon a footing of equality with that of the greatest local god, and send a present to Mexico in the shape of gold, gems, feathers, and cloaks. Before they withdrew, they gave the people with whom they had been speaking with a certain number of shields and swords, so that it might never be said that they had been defeated by treachery. Then they left the town and went to camp at some place on the road, leaving the people of the province 20 days, 1 native month, to reach a decision. If there were no decision at the end of this time, or if the city would not agree, the ambassadors of Texcoco, the Axcautzin, arrived. They gave the lord of the place and his dignitaries a solemn warning. If, after a fresh interval of 20 days, they did not submit, the lord would be punished with death, in conformity with the law that laid down that his head should be broken with a mace, unless he were killed in battle or taken prisoner and sacrificed to the gods. In the same way, the other knights of his household and his court would be punished according to the wishes of the three heads of the empire. When this warning had been given to the lord and all the nobles of his province, they submitted within 20 days. They would be made to give a yearly present to the three sovereigns, but not to a very great amount. And they were all admitted to the grace and friendship of the three sovereigns. If the local lord refused, then at once the ambassadors anointed his right arm and his head with a certain liquid that should allow him to withstand the furious attack of the army of the empire. They set a tuft of feathers, the pilot, sign of nobility, fixed by a band of red leather, upon his head, and gave him a present of many shields, swords, and other weapons. After this, they went to join the first ambassadors to wait until the end of the second respite. If this new period of 20 days elapsed and the rebellious city still would not submit, then a third embassy, sent this time by the king of Tlacopan, came to give a last warning. These envoys addressed the warriors of the city particularly, since it was they who would have gone to bear the brunt of the war. They gave them a third and last respite, and stated that if they were to persist in their refusal, the imperial armies would devastate their province, that the prisoners would be carried off as slaves, and the city reduced to the condition of a dependency. Before withdrawing, they gave swords and shields to the officers and men, and then they joined the two earlier embassies. When the last period of 20 days had expired, the city and the empire were ipso facto in a state of war. Yet even when they waited if it were possible for the augurs to point out a favorable date for the opening of the campaign, one of the 13 signs beginning with Se Itzquintzli, one dog, for example, the series consecrated to the god of the fire and the sun. The Mexicans then knowingly deprived themselves of the advantage of surprise. Not only did they leave their opponents all the time necessary to prepare their defense, but they even supplied them with arms, even if it were no more than a symbolic quantity of them. This whole behavior, these embassies, speeches, and gifts very clearly demonstrate the chivalrous idea of the warrior in American antiquity. It should also be recognized that underlying this, there was the idea that war was truly a divine judgment, that in the long run it was the gods who decided the outcome, and that this decision should have its full value without being perverted in the very beginning, which would be the case if the struggle were too unequal or if the enemy were taken by surprise so that he could not fight. At the same time, with that mixture of idealism and rude common sense which is so often found among the Indians, they had no hesitation in using all the ruses of war. Before ever hostilities began, they sent secret agents into the enemy territory. These men, who were called gimichtin, literally mice, wore the clothes and the headdress of the country and spoke its language. Distinguished traders were also sent on these missions, and they returned to the provinces that they had formerly traveled through as itinerant merchants. These were dangerous missions, for the people of the cities were on their guard. In a country made up of little separate divisions in which everybody was known by his neighbors and in which costume, language, and customs differed from one place to another, it was difficult to pass unnoticed, and the detected spy was put to death at once, together with his accomplices. But if, on the other hand, the spy came safely home and gave an exact account of the peculiarities and the weakness of the place and of the negligence or the vigilance of the people, he was given lands as a reward. Ruses of war were also much used in battle. Bodies of troops would pretend to flee in order to draw the enemy into ambush. By night, warriors would dig trenches that they covered with foliage or straw, and in which they would hide, only coming out when the hoodwinked enemy was unprepared to meet their attack. The Emperor Ashayaka won the Battle of Quapanoyan by just such a stratagem and conquered the valley of Toluca, what should now be called. The engineers were responsible for other kinds of operation. In 1511, the Aztecs took the fortified town of Icpatepec on the top of a precipitous mountain by climbing the cliffs with ladders that were made on the spot. Villages on the lake islands were attacked by raft-borne commandos. In the Codex Nuttall, there is a picture of such an attack by 3 warriors standing in boats that almost sink under their weight, while beneath them swam fishes, crocodiles, and serpents. The basic armament of the Mexican warrior was made up of the brown shield, the chimali, made of wood or reeds, and covered with feathers and mosaic or metal ornaments, and the wooden sword, the maquait, whose cutting edges of obsidian could inflict terrible wounds. As a missile weapon, they had the bow, tlahuitoli, and above all the spear thrower atlat, with which they propelled darts, meat, or javelins, tlacochtli. Some nations, such as the Matlalzinca of the valley of Toluca, used the sling, and the half-savage Chinantec's of the mountains of Oaxaca had long, stone-tipped lances. The Aztec warriors wore a kind of tunic stuffed with cotton, the Ichkahuipili, by way of armor, and helmets more decorative than functional, made of wood, feathers, or paper, loaded with ornaments and plumes. Each chief could be distinguished in the turmoil of battle by a flag or an emblem. These precious and fragile constructions of reeds and feathers, gems and gold were fixed to their shoulders, and each had its own particular name. Only those whose rank and exploits entitled them to it might use one of these ensigns. When a set battle was on the point of beginning, the warriors uttered deafening cries, increased by the dismal howling of conches and the piercing noise of bone whistles. These instruments not only raised the courage of the troops, but also served as signals. Some chiefs hung a little drum about their necks and struck it to give their orders. The archers and javelin throwers first discharged their weapons, and then the warriors rushed forward with sword and shield, using much the same tactics as the Romans did with their pilum and sword. But when the hand-to-hand fighting began, the battle took on an aspect completely unlike anything known in our ancient world. For here it was not so much a matter of killing the enemy as of capturing him for sacrifice. Specialists with ropes followed the fighting men in order to bind those who had been overthrown before they could recover consciousness. The battle spread out into a great number of separate duels in which each tried less to kill his opponent than to gain possession of his person. While the end and aim of each war was to capture an enemy or several enemies, the general intention of operations was clearly to bring about the enemy's defeat. There was, however, a conventional notion of what constituted defeat. A city was beaten and acknowledged itself to be beaten when the attacking force succeeded in reaching the temple and burning the sanctuary of the tribal god. Thus, the symbol for conquest in the native manuscripts is generally a blazing temple with an arrow sticking into it. The taking of the temple was the defeat of the local god and the victory of Huitzilopochtli. From that moment on, the gods had spoken, and all further resistance was useless. The defeat had the nature of a symbol, and it reflected a decision taken upon a more than human level, taken indeed by the gods. Mexican War, therefore, had no resemblance to the total wars which our civilization has brought to such a fatal pitch of efficiency. The Aztecs' intention was not to force the enemy to yield by ruining the country or massacring the population, but to make manifest the will of Huitzilopochtli. As soon as his will had become obvious to everybody, the war had no further object. Those who had presumed to resist the empire, that is, to resist the empire's god, had no possibility other than acknowledging their mistake and trying to obtain the least unfavorable conditions that they could. For war, which began with talks, ended in negotiations. On the very field of battle in the streets of the invaded city, while flames destroyed the sanctuary, an enemy delegation approached the Mexicans. The fighting stopped, and in this temporary armistice, this precarious truce, an astonishing bargaining began. In effect, the defeated said, "We were wrong. We acknowledge our error. Spare us. We beg to be admitted to the protection of your gods and the emperor. Here is what we offer." And the envoys would give the list of the victuals, merchandise, jewels, and services that they proposed as tribute. Generally, the victors replied that these were not enough. "No, you must expect no mercy. As well as this, you must send us men every 10 days to serve by turns in our palaces." They bargained. The defeated would yield a little ground, literally and figuratively. "We will give up our territory as far as Texcoco," said the beaten Chalcas. At the end, the Aztecs said, "Consider what you are pledging yourselves to very thoroughly. Do not come to us one day and say that you never made any such promises." In short, it was a question of a contract agreed to by both victors and vanquished, and which bound the one equally with the other. The idea that underlay this negotiation was that the winner, as the favorite of the gods and their instrument, had all possible rights. If he wished, he could annihilate the conquered city, carry off all the inhabitants or massacre them, and pull down its sanctuary. But he renounced his total power for a consideration. This consideration, or compensation, was the tribute, the ransom as it were, with which the vanquished brought the right to live. The Mexicans insisted that the city should acknowledge the supremacy of Huitzilopochtli, and thus that of Tenochtitlan, that it should have no independent foreign policy, and that it should pay taxes. In exchange, it kept its institutions, its rights, its customs, and its language. The city remained the essential nucleus, the center of all political and cultural life. It was obliged to become a member of the Confederation, but it was not in itself abolished. The empire was nothing more than a league of autonomous cities. There were only a very few towns in which the central government had for special reasons appointed a governor. This was the case at Tlatelolco, for example, which became an integral part of the capital. Nothing would have seemed more incomprehensible to the ancient Mexicans, nor more atrocious than the characteristic features of our modern war: huge destruction, the systematic extermination of whole nations, the annihilation of states, or their overthrow. The only native rulers who ever attempted to do away with any states, as, for example, to destroy the dynasty of Texcoco and wipe the kingdom off the map, were Tezosomoc, the old tyrant of Azcapotzalco, and his son Mashlaton. They were therefore remembered in the 16th century with universal execration. They are the outcasts of the Mexican historical writing. When the rulers of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco had succeeded in defeating the tyrant in 1428, they certainly took care that the tyranny should not rise again. But they also took care to invite Tlacopan, a city belonging to a vanquished tribe, to share the supremacy with them. This was the foundation of the Triple Alliance. Whether it was sacred or political, war in Mexico was always surrounded by a network of conventions. If it were sacred, it could be reduced to a kind of duel arranged for the service of the gods. If it were political, to a crisis or a passing tumult in which the gods would be able to make their decisions known. The campaign might be long because of the very great distances and the absence of any kind of transport, but the battles themselves were short. All these considerations explain to some degree why the last war that ever Tenochtitlan was to wage ended so disastrously for the empire and the civilization of the Aztecs. The Spaniards and the Mexicans were not really fighting the same kind of war. On the material plane, they fought with different weapons. On the social and moral, they had totally different concepts of war. Faced with an unforeseen attack from another world, the Mexicans were no more capable of an adequate response than would be the men of today faced with an invasion from Mars. With their guns, their helmets, and their armor, their steel swords, their horses, and their sailing ships, the Europeans had a decisive superiority over the warriors of Tenochtitlan and their wooden and stone weapons, their canoes, and their troops of infantry, and nothing more. Would a Macedonian phalanx or one of Caesar's legions have been able to withstand artillery? The accounts of the siege of Mexico show how effective the fast-sailing Spanish brigantines were, as they swept the lake with their fire, isolating the surrounding city, cutting its lines of communication, and discouraging all idea of reinforcement. They also show how the guns, by battering down walls and houses, helped the attacks of the conquistadors in the very heart of the embattled city. And above all, as one studies these accounts, one cannot but see that all the traditional rules of war, which the Mexicans instinctively obeyed, were violated equally instinctively by the invaders. Far from negotiating before the battle, they got into Mexico with peaceable words and then suddenly fell upon the Indian nobles massed upon the dancing place in the courtyard of Huitzilopochtli's temple and massacred them. Instead of trying to take prisoners, they killed as many warriors as they could, while the Aztecs wasted their time capturing Spaniards or their native auxiliaries to sacrifice them. At last, when it was all over, the Mexican rulers could have expected a bitter bargaining that would fix the amount of the tribute to be paid to the conquerors. They were physically incapable of imagining what was to come: the overthrow of their entire civilization, the destruction of their gods and their beliefs, the abolition of their political institutions, the torture of the kings for their treasure, and the red-hot iron of slavery. For the Spaniards, for their part, were making total war. There was only one possible state for them, the monarchy of Charles V, and only one possible religion. The clash of arms was nothing to the clash of ideologies. The Mexicans were beaten because their thought, based upon a tradition of pluralism in both the political and the religious aspects of life, was not adapted to contend with the dogmatism of the monolithic state and religion. It is also possible to assert that the institution of the War of Flowers itself may have been an important factor in the downfall of Tenochtitlan, for it had preserved Tlaxcala, an inimical state, almost at the gates of the capital, so that there might be captives to sacrifice to the gods. If the Mexicans had really wished to destroy Tlaxcala and do away with the danger, it was very probable that they could have done so by concentrating the whole strength of their empire on it. They did not do so, no doubt because in the last resort they felt bound by the necessity for perpetuating the Shochiyayot, the Flowery War. Without knowing it, they had thus provided the as yet unknown invader with the ally who was to supply him with his infantry in the retreat in which he could take refuge after his setback. As for the Republic of Tlaxcala, it certainly thought that it was using these powerful strangers for its own ends, that it would profit by them to finish an ordinary war between Mexican cities to its own advantage. Tlaxcala no more saw the real nature of the peril than Tenochtitlan, or if they did, only when it was too late. Insofar as war is not merely Clausewitz's continuation of politics, but a glass which reflects a civilization in its critical moments, when its most fundamental tendencies are visible, the wartime behavior of the Mexicans is extremely revealing. Here are clearly to be seen the promise and the shortcomings of the civilization, a civilization which, isolated from the rest of the world, could not withstand an attack from the outside. By reason of its material inadequacy or the rigidity of its mind, the civilization was defeated, and it perished before it had shown its full potentialities. It went down above all because its religious and legal conception of war paralyzed it before the attack of an invader who acted in accordance with a totally different set of ideas. However paradoxical it may seem at first, one is led to believe that the Aztecs, although they were so warlike, were not warlike enough when they were confronted with 16th century European Christians, or rather that they were, but in another fashion, and that their heroism was as inadequate as and as unavailing as would have been that of the soldiers of the Marne faced with today's atomic bomb. This concludes Chapter 6.